The virtue that becomes self-destruction. Helping others is praised as one of the highest virtues. From childhood, you are taught that generosity is noble, selflessness is admirable, and sacrifice is a mark of character. To refuse help feels cold. To step back feels selfish. So you give, you support, you rescue, again and again. Yet there is a form of helping that does not elevate, it erodes. Some people are not destroyed by cruelty, but by kindness without judgment. Not by hostility, but by compassion offered without clarity. What appears virtuous on the surface slowly becomes a source of exhaustion, resentment, and quiet inner conflict. You begin with sincere intention. You want to ease suffering, solve problems, lift burdens. But over time, something shifts. Your energy drains faster, your patience thins. Your mind feels crowded with concerns that are not truly yours. Still, you continue, convinced that stopping would be a failure of empathy. This is where the danger hides. Helping when unconscious can become a subtle form of self-abandonment, a habit that feels moral, yet steadily destabilizes your emotional balance. Not because helping is wrong, but because helping without discernment ignores a fundamental truth. Not every struggle is yours to carry, and not every person benefits from being saved. Before we examine the reasons, pause for a moment. Have you ever felt tired not from your own life, but from managing someone else's? Have you ever noticed that the more you give, the less it seems to change? Have you ever sensed that your kindness is slowly costing you something you cannot recover? If so, what follows is not an argument against compassion. It is an examination of how compassion, when guided by emotion instead of reason, can quietly turn against you. When helping feeds avoidance. There is a form of helping that feels generous, but functions as escape. You become deeply invested in fixing someone else's life, while your own quietly waits. Their problems become your focus. Their crises become your urgency. Their instability gives you a sense of purpose that feels meaningful, even necessary. But look carefully. How often does helping others delay confronting your own discomfort, your postponed decisions, your neglected ambitions, your avoided responsibilities? It is easier to organize someone else's chaos than to face the silence of your own unfinished life. Helping becomes distraction disguised as virtue. You tell yourself you are being supportive, compassionate, indispensable. Yet beneath that narrative, another mechanism operates. By centering your attention on others, you temporarily escape the weight of self-examination. Their struggles justify your delay. Their needs excuse your inaction. This is not conscious deception, it is psychological relief. To engage fully with your own growth requires effort, clarity, and the willingness to face internal resistance. To help someone else often requires only reaction, advice, comfort, intervention. It feels active without demanding transformation. Epictetus warned about this subtle misplacement of attention. In the discourses of Epictetus, he emphasizes that a person must first govern their own faculty of judgment before attempting to manage anything external. When you neglect your own direction while obsessing over another's, you reverse that order, and reversal breeds imbalance. Over time, you may notice a strange emptiness. You are busy, yet stagnant, engaged, yet unfulfilled, surrounded by problems, yet distant from your own progress. The mind senses the misalignment even when the ego calls it kindness. Helping in this form is not generosity. It is avoidance wearing moral language. The question is uncomfortable but necessary. Are you truly helping them, or are you hiding inside their struggles to avoid facing your own? When helping rewards destructive behavior. Not all help heals. Some help sustains the very patterns that cause suffering. You step in to rescue, to soften consequences, to make things easier. The intention is compassionate. The outcome is often corrosive. When you repeatedly protect someone from the results of their own choices, you interrupt a crucial process. Responsibility dissolves. Accountability weakens. Discomfort, which might have forced reflection, is neutralized before it can teach. Without realizing it, you begin to cooperate with their stagnation. A person who is always rescued rarely confronts themselves. A person whose mistakes are continually absorbed by others rarely develops the inner tension required for change. Your help becomes a buffer between them and reality. Seneca observed this danger with precision. In the letters to Lucilius, he reflects on how excessive indulgence, even when motivated by affection, can weaken character rather than strengthen it. What is spared too often is never learned. Helping becomes reinforcement. The cycle is subtle. They struggle. You intervene. Relief follows. But nothing fundamental shifts. The same crisis returns in a different form. The same instability repeats. The same dependency deepens. Over time, effort moves in one direction while growth remains absent. Frustration quietly accumulates. You may start to feel confused. Why does nothing change? Why do the same problems persist? Why does your support seem to create more need rather than less? The answer is difficult because it challenges a comforting belief that helping is always beneficial. It is not. Help offered without discernment can transform into permission. Permission to avoid effort, permission to repeat errors, permission to remain exactly as they are. And the longer this continues, the heavier the emotional burden becomes for the one who gives. True compassion does not remove necessary friction. It respects the role of consequences. Otherwise, what feels like kindness becomes participation in someone else's self-destruction. When helping creates invisible resentment. Resentment rarely begins with hostility. It begins with generosity, with patience, with repeated understanding. You give time, energy, attention, support, willingly, quietly, without demanding anything in return, at least at first. But human psychology is not indifferent to imbalance. When effort consistently flows in one direction, expectations begin to form. Not spoken, not declared, implied. You start to hope they will change, appreciate, reciprocate, recognize. And when that shift does not happen, something hardens beneath the surface. Resentment grows in silence. You may continue helping outwardly while inwardly feeling irritation, fatigue, even bitterness. Small frustrations begin to carry disproportionate weight. Their behavior feels increasingly heavy. Their lack of progress feels personal. Yet expressing this tension feels uncomfortable, almost shameful. After all, you chose to help. This is the emotional debt no one discusses. Helping can create a hidden contract in the mind. After everything I've done, they should at least. Why do I care more than they do? These thoughts do not emerge because you are cruel. They emerge because prolonged imbalance strains even the most patient disposition. Seneca understood this psychological friction. In his letters to Lucilius, he warned that attachment mixed with expectation inevitably produces disturbance. When you bind your emotional state to how another person responds to your help, you surrender inner stability to variables you do not control. Resentment is the cost of that surrender. What began as compassion slowly transforms into tension. Conversations feel heavier. Interactions feel loaded. You feel trapped between continuing and withdrawing. Neither feels clean. Both feel uncomfortable. And the most dangerous part, resentment contaminates the very kindness that created it. Help becomes less sincere. Patience becomes forced. Emotional warmth cools. The relationship, once grounded in care, becomes quietly burdened by unspoken frustration. Helping, without clarity and boundaries, does not only drain energy, it destabilizes emotional integrity. Because when giving becomes obligation and expectation replaces choice, generosity curdles into resentment. When helping erodes self-respect, there is a moment, often subtle, when helping stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like a surrender. You say yes when you want to say no. You tolerate what you once considered unacceptable. You adjust your boundaries to accommodate behaviors that quietly disturb your peace, all in the name of understanding, patience, compassion. But something important begins to fracture. Self-respect is not lost through dramatic humiliation. It fades through repeated self-betrayal. Each time you override your own judgment to preserve someone else's comfort, you send a silent message inward that your limits are negotiable, your needs secondary, your standards flexible under pressure. Helping becomes the disguise of self-abandonment. You may still appear generous, supportive, even admirable. Yet internally, tension accumulates. A quiet dissatisfaction, a sense of being stretched beyond what feels right. Not because helping is inherently harmful, but because you are acting against your own clarity. Marcus Aurelius reflected on this inner conflict with remarkable honesty. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 8, paragraph 47, he reminds himself that no action should violate the integrity of one's own governing principles. To act against reason, even for socially praised motives, is to disturb the order of the mind. When boundaries collapse, respect collapses with them. You begin to feel less grounded, less decisive, less internally aligned, not necessarily weaker, but divided. One part of you recognizes the imbalance, another insists on continuing. This division erodes confidence in your own judgment, and confidence is inseparable from self-respect. Helping the wrong people often requires enduring repeated discomfort, disrespect, manipulation, or emotional volatility. When you accept these conditions indefinitely, the cost is not merely fatigue, it is the gradual normalization of what your mind once rejected. You adapt to what diminishes you. True generosity does not demand self-erosion. True compassion does not require the abandonment of personal dignity. Stoicism never framed virtue as self-destruction. It framed virtue as alignment with reason. When helping requires you to betray your own clarity, it ceases to be noble. It becomes a slow extraction of self-respect disguised as kindness. Why Stoics were careful with compassion. Stoicism is often mistaken for emotional distance, a philosophy of detachment, indifference, cold restraint. Yet the Stoics did not reject compassion. They refined it. They insisted that care without reason is instability disguised as virtue. Epictetus drew a sharp boundary around responsibility. In the Discourses of Epictetus, he teaches that each person must first govern what belongs to them, their judgments, choices, and responses. To assume ownership over another's character, decisions, or destiny is to step outside the sphere of control and into disturbance. Compassion, without this distinction, becomes entanglement. You cannot live another person's life for them. You cannot carry their lessons, absorb their consequences, or force their awakening. When you attempt this, even with noble intention, frustration becomes inevitable. Not because people are ungrateful, but because reality resists misplaced responsibility. Seneca warned about the emotional risks of excessive involvement. In the letters to Lucilius, he reflects on how easily empathy can slide into emotional dependency. When your inner stability becomes tied to another's improvement, gratitude, or transformation, your peace becomes conditional. And conditional peace is fragile peace. The Stoic approach was neither harsh nor naive. It recognized that true help must respect autonomy, that growth requires friction, that suffering, while painful to witness, often plays a necessary role in the development of judgment and character. To remove every difficulty is not kindness. It is interference. Stoic compassion asks a different question. Not, how can I relieve this discomfort? But, is my intervention aligned with reason or driven by my own emotional unease? This shift transforms helping from impulse into discernment. Care becomes conscious. Boundaries become ethical. Restraint becomes wisdom. The Stoics understood something deeply uncomfortable. Compassion that ignores reality eventually produces harm, either to the one who helps or to the one who is helped, sometimes to both. Measured compassion is not lack of heart. It is respect for nature, limits, and the proper role of reason. When helping becomes identity, helping can quietly evolve from an action into a self-concept. You are no longer someone who helps. You become the helper, the supporter, the one who fixes, rescues, stabilizes, carries. It feels meaningful. It feels like purpose. It feels like who you are. And that is where the trap closes. When helping becomes identity, stepping back feels like losing yourself. Saying no feels like betrayal. Creating distance feels like moral failure. Even when exhaustion, imbalance, and emotional strain are obvious, you continue. Not because it is wise, but because your sense of worth has fused with being needed. The need to be needed is rarely recognized as attachment. It disguises itself as generosity, loyalty, compassion, yet beneath it lies a subtle dependency. Your value becomes tied to your usefulness in someone else's struggle. Their crises validate your role. Their instability sustains your relevance. Without realizing it, you begin to fear their independence more than their suffering. Because independence threatens identity. Marcus Aurelius warned about this internal confusion. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 6, paragraph 30, he reflects on the danger of deriving self-worth from roles that depend on external circumstances. When identity is built on what others require from you, stability disappears the moment those conditions shift. Helping, then, is no longer free. It becomes psychological necessity. You may notice resistance when considering limits, guilt when imagining withdrawal, anxiety at the thought of no longer being central to someone's survival, healing, or progress. These reactions do not arise from compassion alone. They arise from attachment to an identity that now demands constant reinforcement. This is how virtue becomes compulsion. True generosity flows from choice, not fear. True compassion does not require self-definition through sacrifice. Stoicism reminds you that identity must rest on character, judgment, and principles, not on being indispensable to others. Otherwise, helping ceases to be kindness. It becomes the structure around which your ego organizes its need for significance. When helping drains decision energy, every act of helping appears as generosity. Few recognize it as expenditure, not only of time, but of cognitive and emotional resources. To help someone consistently is to think about their problems, anticipate their reactions, manage their emotions, calculate your words, adjust your behavior. Your mind becomes occupied territory. Decision energy is finite. Each day, you wake with a limited capacity for judgment, focus, restraint, and clarity. When a significant portion of that capacity is consumed by concerns that are not truly yours, something predictable happens. Your own decisions become delayed, simplified, or avoided altogether. Mental fatigue masquerades as lack of discipline. You may feel strangely depleted without understanding why. Tasks that require attention feel heavier. Choices that once felt clear feel burdensome. The mind, overloaded by constant emotional management, begins to crave relief, distraction, passivity, ease. Helping has quietly taxed your cognitive reserves. Seneca observed that the mind must be protected as carefully as any material asset. In the letters to Lucilius, he emphasizes that scattered attention weakens judgment. A person who constantly disperses mental energy across unnecessary concerns cannot maintain inner steadiness. Helping the wrong people accelerates this dispersion. Their instability demands repeated engagement. Their crises reset your priorities. Their emotional turbulence pulls your focus outward again and again. Even when you are physically absent, mental involvement continues, replaying conversations, predicting outcomes, carrying tension that does not belong to your own life. This erosion is subtle, but relentless. Over time, you may notice a shift, less patience, less clarity, less capacity for deep thought. Not because you lack strength, but because your decision energy has been steadily drained by problems you cannot resolve and responsibilities you were never meant to carry. Stoicism insists on conservation of inner resources, not as selfishness, but as necessity. Because a mind exhausted by unnecessary emotional labor cannot govern itself effectively. And without self-governance, even the noblest intentions produce imbalance. When helping invites disrespect, respect is shaped by perception, and perception responds to patterns. When helping becomes excessive, automatic, or unconditional, a subtle shift often occurs. What was once received as generosity begins to feel expected. What once inspired gratitude becomes normalized. Value fades through familiarity without boundaries. This is not always malice. It is human psychology. When something is consistently available without cost, effort, or limitation, the mind recalibrates. Appreciation decreases. Entitlement quietly grows. Your help, once seen as a gift, is gradually interpreted as your role, and roles carry obligations. You may notice changes so small they are easy to rationalize. Less acknowledgement, less consideration, more assumptions about your time, your energy, your availability. Requests framed not as favors, but as extensions of what you always do. Overgiving alters relational dynamics. Epictetus warned that how others treat you often reflects what your behavior teaches them to expect. In the discourses of Epictetus, he emphasizes that if you accept a position of perpetual accommodation, you should not be surprised when others interact with you accordingly. Not because they are inherently disrespectful, but because patterns define boundaries when boundaries are not stated. Helping without limits teaches others there are no limits. Resentment may already exist by this stage. Fatigue may already be present. Yet you continue, hoping that consistency will restore appreciation. Often it does the opposite. The more predictable your help becomes, the less visible its value appears. Disrespect rarely arrives as open hostility. It emerges as diminished regard. You feel less seen, less considered, less valued. Not because your generosity lacked sincerity, but because generosity without structure easily transforms into expectation. And expectation erodes the very recognition you once hoped to cultivate. Stoicism does not frame boundaries as barriers to kindness. It frames them as protectors of dignity. Because when helping lowers your perceived value in the eyes of others, the cost is not merely relational tension. It is the gradual erosion of mutual respect, the foundation without which no healthy connection can endure. When helping delays necessary pain, pain is not always an enemy. Often it is instruction. Discomfort forces reflection. Consequences sharpen judgment. Friction compels growth. Yet when you intervene too quickly, too often, or too protectively, you may interrupt a process that reality itself is attempting to complete. Relief replaces learning. To witness someone struggle is uncomfortable. To watch them face the results of their choices can feel almost unbearable when you care. So you step in. You soften the fall. You remove the pressure. You create space where tension was meant to operate. But growth requires tension. Seneca reflected on this with clarity. In the letters to Lucilius, he observed that difficulty strengthens the mind in ways comfort never can. A life stripped of necessary hardship produces fragility, not resilience. When you consistently shield others from discomfort, you may preserve their immediate feelings while weakening their long-term capacity. Helping becomes obstruction disguised as compassion. Some lessons cannot be taught through advice. Some transformations cannot occur through reassurance. Certain insights arise only when a person fully encounters the weight of reality without interruption. When pain is prematurely removed, the catalyst for change disappears. The cycle continues. They repeat the mistake, recreate the crisis, re-enter the same suffering. Not because they are incapable, but because the corrective force of consequence has been diluted. What might have triggered awakening instead becomes another temporary episode resolved by external support. You feel helpful. They remain unchanged. Stoicism never promised protection from difficulty. It recognized adversity as a necessary element of development. Epictetus emphasized that obstacles are not interruptions of the path, but the path itself. When you deny others the friction required for their growth, you assume a role no one can fulfill without causing distortion. Compassion must respect reality. Otherwise, helping delays not only pain, but evolution. And what feels like kindness in the present may quietly prolong suffering in the future, for them, and eventually for you. When helping costs, your future time is the one resource that never replenishes. Energy can return, motivation can recover, even lost money can be rebuilt, but time, once spent, is irretrievable. When helping the wrong people becomes a persistent pattern, the cost extends far beyond fatigue or frustration. It begins to consume your future. Each hour absorbed by someone else's recurring crises is an hour not invested in your own direction. Each emotional burden carried for another is attention withdrawn from your own growth. Progress rarely collapses suddenly. It erodes through gradual diversion. Years can disappear this way. You may look back and notice a disturbing realization: so much effort, so much patience, so much emotional expenditure. Yet your own ambitions remained postponed, your own plans delayed, your own development placed quietly in the background while you stabilized lives that never stabilized. Helping became a slow redirection of your life's trajectory. Marcus Aurelius often reflected on the brevity and fragility of existence. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 4, paragraph 17, he reminds himself that life is limited and must be governed with deliberate awareness. To squander attention on what does not truly belong to one's purpose is not generosity. It is unconscious surrender of what cannot be recovered. Misplaced compassion becomes existential leakage. You are not only giving energy, you are giving seasons of your life, opportunities that required focus, efforts that required discipline, decisions that required clarity, all diluted by constant involvement in problems that repeat because they are rooted in choices you do not control. The danger is rarely visible in the moment. It becomes visible in retrospect. When you realize that while you were trying to save others, no one was protecting the direction of your own life, that your potential was not blocked by inability, but by dispersion, that your future was not taken from you, but slowly exchanged for obligations you never consciously agreed to carry. Stoicism demands awareness of this trade, not to suppress kindness, but to preserve wisdom, because helping the wrong people does not only drain the present, it can quietly mortgage the only life you have. Discernment over impulse. The solution is not to harden your heart, not to withdraw into indifference, not to confuse wisdom with emotional coldness. Stoicism does not teach the abandonment of compassion. It teaches the governance of compassion by reason. Helping must move from impulse to discernment. Impulse reacts to discomfort. You see suffering and feel compelled to intervene. You sense distress and rush to relieve it. The intention feels noble, but intention alone cannot determine whether an action is wise. Without reflection, helping becomes automatic, and what is automatic cannot be measured. Discernment introduces clarity. Before acting, you pause, you examine. Is this truly mine to carry? Does this intervention align with reason, or is it driven by guilt, fear, or the need to reduce my own emotional unease? This space between perception and response is where self-command begins to reassert itself. Epictetus insisted on this separation. In the discourses of Epictetus, he teaches that we must distinguish what belongs to our faculty of choice from what belongs to the lives of others. Their character, decisions, and willingness to change remain outside your authority. Your judgment, boundaries, and actions remain within it. Helping becomes a conscious act, not a reflex. Boundaries cease to feel like cruelty. They become ethical structure, a way of protecting both your stability and the autonomy of others. Compassion guided by reason does not rush to rescue. It evaluates context, capacity, consequences. Sometimes it acts, sometimes it refrains. This shift transforms the emotional experience of helping. Guilt begins to loosen. Resentment begins to dissolve. Exhaustion begins to diminish. Not because you stopped caring, but because care is no longer entangled with compulsion or misdirected responsibility. You are no longer driven by the need to fix every struggle. You choose where your energy is invested. Stoic discernment does not ask you to help less. It asks you to help wisely, to ensure that generosity does not violate judgment, that compassion does not erase boundaries, that empathy does not override reason. Because helping governed by clarity strengthens both parties. Helping governed by impulse destabilizes both. A hard but liberating truth. There is a truth that feels uncomfortable until it becomes freeing. Not everyone should be saved. Not every problem is yours to solve. Not every suffering is an invitation to intervene. Wisdom sometimes looks like restraint, You can care deeply and still refuse to participate in cycles that drain your energy, distort your judgment, and erode your stability. You can remain compassionate without becoming entangled. You can offer help without surrendering clarity. Stoicism asks for this maturity. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly returned to the discipline of accepting human nature as it is, not as he wished it to be. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 9, paragraph 29, he reflects on the necessity of acting with justice and goodwill while releasing the illusion that others must respond, improve, or transform according to our expectations. People change when they are ready, not when you exhaust yourself trying. To accept this is not cynicism, it is alignment with reality. When you release the compulsion to rescue everyone, something stabilizes internally. Your kindness becomes cleaner because it is chosen, not driven by guilt or fear. Your boundaries become firmer because they are grounded in reason. Your energy becomes protected because it is no longer scattered across struggles you cannot govern. Compassion regains its proper form, measured, conscious, sustainable. The goal was never to help at any cost. The goal was to live with clarity, integrity, and steadiness of mind, to give without self-destruction, to care without losing yourself, to recognize that virtue is not defined by how much you sacrifice, but by how wisely you act. Sometimes the most humane response is not intervention, it is allowing reality to teach what you cannot. And in that acceptance, both strength and peace quietly return. If you enjoyed the video, like and share. Subscribe for more Stoic insights and watch the latest videos.